Angelina and Sarah Grimke were the daughters of a prominent slave-owning family in South Carolina. In the 1830s, they were sent to Philadelphia for education. In Philadelphia, which of course was a center of Quakerism, Quakers were among the earliest abolitionists, they came into contact with anti-slavery people and became converted to Quakerism and abolitionism. Now, it was rather unusual to have Southerners involved as abolitionist spokesmen. They had grown up in a slave society. They had grown up in a slave household. They knew slavery from personal experience. And they began speaking about their experiences observing slavery.
Lift Up Thy Voice, the Grimke family's journey from slaveholders to civil rights leaders. The novel Lift Up Thy Voice expresses the story of Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the famous abolitionist Grimke sisters who willingly gave up their positions as late daughters of a prominent Southern slaveholding family in South Carolina for their determinations to live a life of devotion and service as abolitionists and women advocates, and that of their equally devoted nephews. Throughout his novel, Mark Perry dives into the use of the sisters that developed their anti-slavery perspectives, their conversion to Quakerism and their equality-dedicated lifestyles, their meeting of the slave brothers of their deceased brother, and, with emphasis, the prominent and impactful role in abolitionism across both pairs of siblings.
As the daughter of one of South Carolina's first families, Angelina Grimke lived in almost unimaginable luxury. In the 1820s, Charleston's aristocracy was one of the wealthiest societies on earth. But Angelina found it almost unbearable. An empire of sin.
Sarah Grimke was born in 1792. At only 11 years, she displayed an intrigue and learning of all sorts, including the sort not dedicated to women at the time, and a deep disgust in slavery, shown in her secret teachings of slaves like 10-year-old girl Hetty. She began to question the Catholic religion and its supposed acceptance and even encouragement of slavery. When her sister Angelina was born, she was only 13, and she begged to be the child's godmother, taking much seriousness in her role and raising the more outspoken Angelina against slavery. Throughout her teenage years, she deliberated between flighty, expected female roles and her dedication to religion, now converted to Presbyterianism. Her focus was eventually pushed towards religion by three major interactions with Reverend Henry Collick between 1812 and 1816. In her 26th year, her father fell ill, and she resignedly joined him in a journey to discover the cause of his illness. Sarah was prized by her father up until his dying moments. When an unknown illness consumed him and signals his approaching death, only her did he wish to stay with. In truth, as they both knew, John Grimke understood his daughter better than anyone. He trusted her intellect, but valued her judgment and companionship earnestly, the child that was more like him than any other child. In her younger years, though he had discouraged her from teaching slaves, he had never truly punished her, and ignored many of her more openly abolitionist actions. He needed someone that would tell him the truth in his final weeks, and that he could talk openly with. As Mark Perry states, he made his choice. He would die not with his family, but with his daughter, his most beloved child, by his side. While Sarah was exploring her opinions on religion and passing out of a marriageable age with her father's death, Angelina was just approaching adolescence. Sarah had been soft-spoken on her views, plagued by self-doubt and feelings of inadequacy. Angelina, on the other hand, grew into quite a different individual from her sister, sharpening her skepticism and putting her prayers and doubts into action, rather than merely praying for guidance and questioning as her sister did. This showed in young Angelina's agreeing to care for a younger slave, Kitty, who had incited her mother's anger. Angelina placed the young girl with a good Christian family that was kind to its servants, and received the girl back as a mature and believing Christian. Angelina then told her mother that kindness was more than just a word used by well-meaning ministers in Sunday sermons.
Crack the book that rewrites history and grow new eyes to legal injustice. As a girl, I watched color decide. The lines between human and not hit me like the whip he used on your back. Your blood flowed, your screams choked my sense of humanity like a millstone around my neck, growing heavier with each black face pushed to the dirt. They said you weren't allowed to know what letters meant on a page, but when sleep took every head and their rules to bed, in the flicker of candlelight guarded, I taught you worlds to be discovered. Without warning, your breath left your tiny body and became a flame inside me, burning until your people are equal to mine. As a woman, They said my actions were unnatural when I spoke up for those forgotten. I do not fight for special treatment of those deemed less than, but I ask for opportunity to be equal, to see eye to eye, and not be condemned because I have a woman's body. I know something of your suffering when oppression becomes comfortable and our names no longer matter. Stand with me. Hear the words that I pen to you in defense of something better. With conviction piercing our souls and a message of love, we ask you kindly, brothers, to take your feet off our shoulders and give us a chance to breathe, to occupy the space that God intended. The rules that ignored injustice broke when I refused to follow. Every box you shut me in, I throw away, because the oppression I witnessed and endured haunts me until justice is proclaimed, truth is realized, and we're all called humanity again.
After her father's death, Sarah encountered a Quaker, Israel Morris, on her return voyage, who gave her some texts to study. Increasingly secluded after the ordeal, and then sent to North Carolina to be with some other family, Sarah opened the text, increasingly identifying with Quaker ideals, and then moving to Philadelphia to live with the Morrises, and accepting Quaker dress before a quick return home. Here, the clashing of her own and Southern ideals sent her away again. Sarah received a marriage proposal from Israel Morris, but rejected it, fearing that marriage would limit her ability to pursue religion and her dream of becoming a Quaker minister. In the meantime, the rest of the world was beginning to strike out more against slavery. On July 4, 1829, William Lord Garrison gave the Independence Day address in Boston, where he criticized a celebration of independence that did not include Black Americans, stating his shame in the country full of hypocrisy on freedom. Angelina was reaching her own conversion to Quakerism, but with a much different view on religion than her sister. Rather than a means to self-discipline, Angelina saw religion as an instrument of instruction, questioning others rather than herself, and seeing her doubts, failures, and desires not as sin, but as lessons, molding her religion to suit her life. Horrified by slavery, Angelina chose to flee Philadelphia, not to increase her devotion as her sister had, but in recognition that she could not overthrow slavery alone and so free herself from the political system. Through this, the sisters began to recognize color prejudice as the real evil of slavery.
The daughter of a southern plantation owner, Angelina Grimke, who in the late 1820s struggled with slavery and had felt from when she was very young that it was a terrible, terrible institution, and she saw it up close and could no longer live with it and fled to the north and became an abolitionist.
Even with Nat Turner's rebellion, the sisters could not solidify their beliefs or their devotions, unable to form a plan of action in the anti-slavery debate. In came Theodore Dwight Weld, who had been converted by the power of Finney's sermons and emotions. He began working closely with the Grimke sisters for political organization to defeat slavery. Through connecting with other reformers in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, the sisters developed their speaking skills and joined the American Anti-Slavery Society. By the mid-1830s, the sisters began calling for immediate emancipation in an appeal to the Christian women of the South, and an epistle to the clergy of the Southern states. They then advocated through letters to Catherine Beecher and the famous Letters on the Equality of the Sexes in 1838.
Now, at that time, it was considered quite inappropriate for women to speak to mixed male-female audiences. Women were supposed to speak to women's auxiliary. They were female anti-slavery societies. Now, what happened was when the Grimkes began speaking, men started sneaking into their lectures because they wanted to hear what they had to say. And eventually they started saying, look, our job is to spread the word of abolitionism. We should speak to as many people as we can. And they began speaking to mixed audiences. Well, this led to a lot of controversy. The Massachusetts Congregational Clergy issued a statement denouncing them for stepping outside the proper sphere of womanhood. And that led the Grimkes to defend the right of women to speak in public, to move beyond the question of slavery to whether women had the same rights in the public sphere as men did. And then Sarah Grimke published this wonderful set of essays published under the Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, 1837, I think it was, maybe 1838, but in which she claimed all the rights for women that men enjoyed. Grimke said, look, you know, women are equal creatures. They're created by God. They have the same soul. They have the same aptitude. So the Grimkes really launched, in many ways, the public demand for full equality for women in American society.
Through their repeated letter exchanges on their lives, views, and hopes for the future, Angelina and Theodore Weld had become increasingly close and were married in May 1838. Angelina somewhat retreated after her marriage, as did Weld, though Sarah became even more outspoken on women's rights than her sister, but without the younger woman's oratory skill. Slavery became even less important to the three in the following years, but with the death of their mother and the birth of Angelina and Theodore's first child, Charles, the sisters became more interested in religious experiences, becoming entranced by spiritualism. The Seneca Falls Convention passed, delighting the sisters, who were invited but unable to attend, as a turning point for women reformers. With Theodore's journey to Washington to fight the gag rule, Angelina and Sarah were left to raise the children, which was mostly left to Sarah due to Angelina's ill health. However, in 1853, clashes over how to raise them separated the sisters, but they reconciled after a year and never separated again. The quiet of the 50s for the siblings, however, ended abruptly with the outbreak of war, one which Angelina declared to be committed to securing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. At the end of the war, their sister Eliza came from Charleston for a visit, declaring that the family lands were confiscated and that the slaves had been freed. Theodore, Angelina, and Sarah entered retirement in the late 1860s, having mostly succeeded in their challenge in bringing the horror of slavery into American homes and making all Americans recognize reality. However, in 1868, Angelina was stunned by a notice in the National Anti-Slavery Standard noting two black students at a university named Grimke. The sisters soon met their nephews, sons of their brother Henry, and embraced Francis and Archibald to guide them into law and ministry. Sarah died in 1874, Angelina in 1879, and Weld in 1895, but lived on through their nephews, who became civil rights advocates and critics of Booker T. Washington's philosophy and W.E.B. Du Bois's adversarial tendencies. With the publishing of The Heart of the Race Problem by Archibald in 1906, he revealed the double standard of whites and examined color phobia.
Angelina Grimke never surrendered the vision of a more perfect society, in which black and white, men and women, walk together in the ways of God.
I was thinking about what Angelina's, ideology, if I could put it into one sentence. And there was a letter she wrote to Catherine Beecher, and it said, "I recognize no rights but human rights." It was very simple. It's very simple, and it's very clear. There's no difference between man, woman, black, white, rich, poor. These are our national heroes.
Meanwhile, Francis accepted Washington's challenge and took a 4-year interlude in the South to speak as often as possible at Southern industrial colleges, leaving his wife Charlotte behind. Disappointed by law, Archibald became a leading spokesman for African American rights and developed The Opening Up of Africa, along with a biography of William Lloyd Garrison and Charles Sumner. After Booker T. Washington's speech declaring his support for a ceasefire of sorts between whites and blacks, splitting the civil rights movement, Archibald became a diplomat and negotiator in Santo Domingo, dividing his time between Boston and Washington after his return in 1897. Francis wrote a series of sermons on the Atlanta Compromise, where he created a credible black response to white supremacy and questioned Booker. Black leaders flocked to endorse his views and support his leadership as an alternative to Booker, who retaliated for 2 years against the Middle Road Brothers, though the Grimkes recognized him as one of them regardless. Archibald advanced to the height of his power in the 50s, though forcing his daughter Angelina to sacrifice her personal life for his. He eventually became the local leader of the NAACP, to be awarded the Spingarn Medal, and Francis continued at the 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Archibald's health failed in 1928 at 79 years. He died the next year, and his brother Francis would live for another 7. Angelina lived a quiet life and died a recluse in 1958. Perry states that it may be an injustice to group the 5 Grimkes together, with all of their distinctions. He calls them Sarah the Seeker of God, Angelina the Activist, Archibald the Militant, Francis the Moralist, and the younger Angelina, the woman who loved life, who hated hate, and who remembered in her words the ghost of her white mother. But all of them were Grimkes, all Americans, and all great contributors to the abolitionist and civil rights movement of America. His bibliography cites 12 pages of varying resources, citations spreading from the 1830s to the 21st century. His novel does not expect readers to be very familiar with the subject. Unfortunately, Perry fails to go very deep into the depth onto the position of mulattoes and the abolitionist position on interraciality post-abolitionism, nor does he fully dive into the concept of color phobia and its true contextual meaning. However, the book still provides a fair, telling, and rather complete story of the journeys of two very different but very dedicated pairs of equality-seeking siblings.